Welcome to the webinar of Foundation for Philippine Progress. You are tuning in to the third installment of our signature event series called Philippines is in the Heart. Today's event is Battle of Bessang Pass, the untold stories of the Filipino guerrillas. Good afternoon from Portland. We also have people joining from all over the US and the Philippines. Good morning, magandang umaga. Thank you for joining us. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pagdalo. The Rondalia music you heard just playing in the background was generously donated to us by Erna Cruz Dewey of the American Center of Philippine Arts based in Oakland. Maraming salamat, Erna. My name is Rosella De Leon and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Joining me in different parts of our program is our volunteer staff team. They are responsible for putting together this webinar series. So we have Roger Rigor, our PR coordinator. For our project coordinators, we have Jeline Abenoja and Ai Calalo. And lastly, we have Ronald Antonio, who is our marketing director. Thank you very much for putting everything together to make this event happen. And now for our virtual code of conduct. In our initial conception of this series, we had imagined that it will be held in person. And we wish that we can gather in person and get to know one another. However, we recognize that these are unprecedented times and we're doing the best that we can to still stay connected. And because we know that this online platform might be new to some of you, we want to go over the virtual code of conduct during our time together. So first, please rename yourself with your name, city, and organization from which you are joining us today. For example, you see there my name, Rosella. I'm from Portland, Oregon, and my organization is FPP, or Foundation for Philippine Progress. So if you click the participants list, you'll see that there are 3 dots above your name. So you may click that and then click rename, and that should allow you to rename yourself. Again, once you see your name in the participants list, you'll see that there are 3 dots above your name. So just click on that, click rename, and then that should allow you to rename yourself with your name, city, and organization. Second, please mute yourselves, your phone or your computer microphone throughout the webinar. You are more than welcome to type your comments or questions in the chat room throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, please utilize the chat room by clicking the chat button found in the controls in the bottom of your screens. Our lecture moderators for today will be looking at the chats throughout the webinar as you follow along the presentation. And today's webinar will be recorded and then uploaded to our YouTube page afterwards. So you could still share this with your friends and network and those who aren't able to make it today. And now I invite Roger Rigor to talk a little bit about our organization.
Good afternoon. This webinar series is brought to you by the Foundation for Philippine Progress. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is dedicated to empower and engage communities in programs and projects for the Philippines to secure quality health, education, and basic human rights for every Filipino. We are based in Portland, Oregon, but we work with communities across the United States while conducting our projects for vulnerable communities in the Philippines. I'd like to show you our promo video.
The Philippines, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, Lumad, Aita, workers, students, farmers, mothers, fathers, grandchildren, nurses, teachers, 7,000 islands without enough water. Typhoon prone. Vast and rich lands. But the people are hungry. So we've partnered with organizations in the Philippines, nonprofits, hospitals, relief organizations, to launch the Foundation for Philippine Progress. To partner with you for a united, whole, rich Philippines. For a full life for every Filipino.
As an educator, I have always followed this insight from Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Quote, education is an act of love and thus an act of courage, unquote. I've also been retired for a year now, but in the spirit of education in pursuit of truth, one cannot simply say, I am done. Especially in the midst of today's global crisis, it will never be done. More so with the Philippines in our hearts. It has been both a privilege and an honor to be a part of an organization that follows the calling for action and compassion. The Foundation for Philippine Progress has been extending this for 2 years now and reaching out to those most in need is both inspiring and impressive, furthering its vision of a full life for every Filipino. It has embarked on missions to provide medical and surgical needs to the marginalized in far-flung areas, mobilized immediate and direct help in disaster relief operations, conducted community education resources and activities for barrios in far-flung areas, impacted by environmental or socioeconomic challenges. These, among many other worthy actions. And because each and every one of you here today has the Philippines in your heart, we are thankful and hopeful for your continuing support through donations, participation, or volunteering efforts. Today being the 4th of July, we hope to foster through our actions a more meaningful celebration of our solidarity with our kababayans in the Philippines, in their perseverance beyond the crisis of the times. And though this side of the Pacific abounds in celebration right across and among struggling nations and peoples, today, as in the words of Frederick Douglass, is, quote, a scorching irony, and the conscience of this nation must be aroused. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder, unquote. So now to talk about the Philippines in the Heart series, I invite Ronald Antonio.
Thank you, Kuya Roger. The 7-part launch of Philippines is in the Heart, our signature event series, is carefully curated as our own contribution in keeping the Philippines alive in our hearts. We want to utilize our platform to provide current and accurate bits and pieces about Philippine history, culture, food, language, along with the current situation on the ground. We want to maximize our platform to get together with all of you to discuss any and everything about the Philippines and to be a place where we can have truthful and meaningful discussion about what is dear to us. After all, we know that even though a lot of us are not back home in the motherland, the Philippines is in our hearts. Scheduled around key historic moments such as Philippine Independence Day today, June 12th, Philippine American Friendship Day, which is today, and the Philippine State of the Nation Address on July 27th. This webinar series is designed to enjoin participants to learn more truths about the Philippines through the lens of historians, scholars, community organizers, and our volunteer partners for progress in the US and in the Philippines who are doing tireless work on the ground. We named our series Philippines is in the Heart to honor and commemorate Carlos Bulasan and his work. He was a writer, poet, novelist, and a nationalist who arrived in Seattle in 1930. His story and work have made a difference in the lives of so many of us. Like so many Filipinos, Carlos Bulasan migrated to the US in search of a better life. His experiences and hardships as a new immigrant living in America were documented in his prolific writing and is best known for his novel America's in the Heart, followed by his collection of short stories, The Philippines is in the Heart. Like Carlos Bulasan, we recognize for a lot of overseas Filipino workers who have been living in the streets of Saudi, Lebanon, and Hong Kong because they lost their jobs due to COVID-19 pandemic. They cry for help in order to continue supporting their families back home. Philippines is in their hearts. For a lot of our kababayans who are grieving the tragic loss of their relatives, who they can't even see because of the travel restrictions, we know that Philippines is in their hearts. For 100,000 Filipino seafarers who are currently stuck at sea and have been longing to go home to their families, the Philippines is in their hearts. For a lot of our kababayans whose upbringing have been separated from the beauty of the Philippine culture and traditions and are trying to reconnect to their roots through Filipino food and learning Tagalog, we know that Philippines is in their hearts. I fell in love with our people when I went back to the Philippines in 1998 and returned with my 2 kids in 2013 to help with typhoon relief. I fell in love all over again when I found out that there were other Filipinos who also care about the Philippines and wanted to give back, especially when the foundation launched in 2018, a foundation that is dedicated to serving the Filipino people. And by our people, meaning the people who are neglected, disenfranchised, and stigmatized by our society. The Philippines is in their hearts too. Filipino or not, born in the Philippines or not, the love for the Philippines is something we all share. Our signature event series exists to honor that. We hope that you enjoy this series that we've put together for you.
Thank you, Ron. So during the launch of this series last week, we started a raffle. All of the participants of the webinar had a chance to win some prizes that bring us closer to the Philippines. So prizes like Carlos Bulusan books, Filipino cookbooks, traditional Filipino textile, Tagalog English dictionary, and traditional Filipino accessories. To participate in the raffle, we had encouraged participants to make a donation, if you are able, of at least $5 to support our work. So from last week and the week before that, there were donations that came in who will be part of this raffle today. So if you are so inclined, please share in the chat that you intend to make a donation, and our staff will jot down your names to include in the raffle today. These simple acts do so much in changing the quality of life of our kababayans in the Philippines. Your names will be in the raffle basket for the rest of this webinar series. And for today's event, we will be picking the winners before we wrap up for the night. And now to start us off with today's event, the Battle of Bessang Pass, the untold story of the Filipino guerrillas, I invite Roger and Ron, who will introduce our guest historian.
The story of World War II in the Philippines would usually focus on the fall of Bataan and Corregidor and the infamous death march that followed. The continuing narrative of such tumultuous defeat against the Japanese Imperial Army is the backdrop that makes the I shall return declaration of General Douglas MacArthur seem like it was solely his American forces that liberated the Philippines from the Japanese occupation. Today, we are privileged to have this opportunity to hear from a highly respected Filipino war historian, a presentation on why this battle of Bessang Pass should be retold and reassessed in the context of its historical significance.
But before we introduce our guest speaker for tonight, I would like to announce that we will be having a short Q&A afterwards to entertain any questions that may come up during the presentation. Please type your questions in the chat box, which you will find at the menu at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further delay, allow me to introduce our featured speaker for tonight. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in history from the University of Philippines, Diliman, And in 1995, he received his PhD in History and Area Studies from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He also specializes in the history of World War II in the Philippines, Philippine military and diplomatic history, and is the author of several books and articles published in the Philippines and abroad. Please give your undivided attention to Dr. Ricardo T. Jose.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy 4th of July. And to those listening in the Philippines, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And it is a topic that has been very close to my heart. I've known several of the veterans who fought in this battle. And as we'll see later on, we'll see why this battle became very important. It has been called the battle in the clouds, the battle of the clouds, battle of in the clouds, because it was fought at such a high level, high level geographically. The Bessang Pass area is about 6,000 feet above sea level, which makes it about 2,000 meters above sea level, and very strategic. It's a very important location, as we shall see in a little while. So next slide. Okay, next one, let's skip this one. Okay, so what was the Battle of Bessang Pass? It was the battle for a strategic mountain pass in Ilocos Sur, in the mountains. It was called the Battle of the Clouds, or the Battle in the Clouds, because it was fought so high up. And much of the fighting took place when fog or even the clouds shrouded the area. It was important because it was a third front. The Americans wanted this third front because they were stuck in two other fronts and they couldn't proceed to General Yamashita's headquarters. General Yamashita had, by late December of 1944, had moved his forces and his headquarters into the mountain areas north of Baguio, essentially the mountain province area. The other point that I'd like to make in this Battle of Bessang Pass is that it was fought by Filipino guerrilla forces. It lasted for almost 3 months. And the Filipino guerrilla forces were called upon by the Americans because first, the Americans trusted them to be able to do a man's job. And the 4 American divisions in Luzon at that time were really bogged down in their own respective battle fronts. So the Americans and we needed a third front, and the guerrillas would open that third front. But it was a very small unit. It was only one Filipino regiment. It's about 1,000 men, 1,200 men, against one Japanese division, which at full strength was about 15,000 to 20,000 men. That's almost 1 to 10 odds. And if you add to that the difficulties of the terrain, you'd see why this was a very, very difficult battle that was fought. Next slide. This is what Bessang Pass looked like just after the war in 1945. Part of it was shrouded in trees, and since it was so high up, many of these trees were pine trees. But Bessang Pass is that pass that we see there. It was cut in the mountains so that vehicles and people could move from the lowlands into the upland areas. Now, after Bessang Pass was a town called Cervantes, which is the last town of Ilocos Sur. Very strategic because whoever held that town, and therefore whoever also held this pass, held the gateway to Yamashita's headquarters coming in from the west. If you notice the terrain, it's very steep, very rugged, only one road. It was then called Highway 4. Today it's the Tagudin Cervantes Road. And that road was not even paved. It was only a road, it was only a dirt road. But you'll notice in this particular picture that parts of the area are already battle scarred because there was so much fighting. Bombs were dropped in this area. And to reach this area were several mountains covering the fronts. Each of those mountains was well defended with caves and tunnels and foxholes and other Japanese defenses. So you can imagine what it was like if you were a Filipino soldier to climb up the hill right here and reach up to the top. It's said in military history, military strategy, that whoever held the high ground held the commanding position, had a major advantage. Our boys were starting from the ground and working their way up. So it was an uphill battle, literally and figuratively, to challenge the Japanese who were up in the top, in the high ground, and to defeat them. Next slide. So where exactly is Bessang Pass? Bessang Pass is in Ilocos Sur. If you take the highway leading up to Ilocos Norte, coming from the lowlands, coming from La Union, you're going to pass a town called Tagudin. And Tagudin is where you have the intersection that leads towards Bessang Pass. This shows the coastal road of Ilocos Sur, Ilocos Norte. And next slide. This is a close-up of that area. So Tagudin is there. We see it in the center. And off to the right side, you see the mark saying Bessang Pass. The map is a little wrong, actually, because Bessang Pass comes before Cervantes, to the west of Cervantes. So to reach the last town of Ilocos Sur on the east, you had to pass through Bessang Pass first. You will note also that Bessang Pass is very close to Tirad Pass. Tirad Pass, of course, was very famous because of General Del Pilar's defense in the Phil-American War. General Del Pilar was fighting against the American forces then to try to prevent the Americans from breaking into the line of Aguinaldo. So in a sense, by 1945, you had conditions reversed. Instead of the Americans chasing the Americans chasing us, it was us who were chasing the Japanese, very close to each other, Tirad Pass and Bessang Pass. And our men knew that very well. They knew how historic this was, that this was going to be a historic battle, and that the people who fought in it would share the same difficulties, the same honors that Del Pilar would face and his men. Next slide. Close-ups of the area today would show that this area of Bessang Pass and the road that leads to it is really a nature park. It is a nature park today. It's a very beautiful area, rugged mountains, trees. Essentially, it is untouched by man. There are no skyscrapers. There are no huge buildings. But while this is so today, imagine what this must have been like 75 years ago. And what we are commemorating through this webinar is actually the 75th anniversary of the fighting that took place there. The fighting culminated in the takeover of Bessang Pass on June 14, which was about 3 weeks ago. And I'm sure there were major events scheduled for this before the outbreak of the virus took place. But it's very difficult to get to even today. The road is rough, and the mountains are as beautiful as ever. Next slide. Now, why was Bessang Pass very important? Okay, basically, there were two reasons why the Bessang Pass area was extremely important. It was the backdoor to General Yamashita's mountain position. General Yamashita's position was located in Kiangan, in Hongduan, very near the rice terraces. But in order to reach that, you had to pass either Baguio, or you had to come from the lowlands from Balete Pass, or you could pass through Bessang Pass. These are the three areas that you would have. The Americans were stuck after they took Baguio in April. They couldn't move forward very quickly. They were very difficult. They were stopped by the Japanese. From the Cagayan Valley area, from Balete Pass, they were also stuck because of the very narrow trail that led to Yamashita's headquarters. So this will be the third front. And since the Americans lacked forces, the guerrillas were tasked to do this. Also, capture of Bessang Pass would prevent the threat of any Japanese counterattacks onto Ilocos Norte and especially Ilocos Sur, the lowlands. Because as long as that pass was there and yet Japanese troops in that area, they could rush out and threaten the supply lines and threaten the lowland areas by counterattacks or by surprise attacks. So Bessang Pass had to be taken for these two reasons. And the Americans didn't have troops for that, so it was the Filipino guerrillas, who they felt could do a good job. And in fact, they would do a very good job. Next slide. This is a Japanese map showing the area that we're talking about. I have tried to translate some of the places to Tuguegarao, Ilagan, Balete Pass, Baguio, and you'd see that the area in the red box, that is where the Bessang Pass area is. You see where the sign says Yusafe, that is where our boys would come in. Bessang Pass is right there in between the two arrows that we see there. And that flag that you see there, the black and white flag, that's where Yamashita had his headquarters. So you see, we were very close to it, actually. While the Americans were stopped in Baguio and they were stopped in the Balete Pass area, the Villaverde Trail. So this was a very strategic area. And this, to me, as I was looking for maps to highlight the location, this was the easiest map to understand because it really showed the importance of Bessang Pass and how this was the back door to General Yamashita's headquarters. Next slide. This is a US Army map that came up in the official US Army history. And it also shows, albeit a more technical and more difficult map to understand, it shows the different units involved. Those in the ovals are essentially the Japanese units. And the unit that did most of the fighting in Bessang Pass is on the left side. It's that unit, the square with the X in it, which means that it's an infantry unit. It says there USAFIP NL 121. That was the 121st Infantry Regiment, which would do the bulk of the fighting in Bessang Pass for that 3-month period. You have other scattered units to the north, to the east, but these were all very difficult. It was very difficult for them to reach the battle area because they were so far from the area. You'll also notice that the 121st Infantry Regiment in the west had a very large front to cover. It covered essentially the bulk of Ilocos Sur and went all the way down to La Union, to San Fernando. So it was in the thick of the fighting. Next slide. So what were these guerrilla units? The overall guerrilla unit in the northern Luzon area by late 1944 was something called the USAFIP NL. U.S. Army Forces in the Philippines, Northern Luzon. So this was the USAFIP NL. It covered a large area. It covered part of Pangasinan, it covered La Union, it covered Ilocos Sur, Ilocos Norte, it covered the Cagayan Valley, it covered the Mountain Province area, it covered Abra. The whole area was essentially USAFIP NL. It was under Colonel Russell Volckmann, a professional U.S. Army officer, West Point graduate, an unsurrendered Bataan veteran. He had fought in Bataan, escaped the death march, and made his way to the Mountain Province area to establish and to link up with the different guerrilla units that were there. And eventually, they put all of the different scattered guerrilla units into this USAFIP NL. Next slide. This is a sketch of Colonel Volckmann immediately after the war. The person who sketched this was a Japanese prisoner of war who was so impressed by his dignity, by his courage, by his heroic stance that this Japanese prisoner of war sketched him. You'll see the colonel's eagle in his collar and the infantry emblem on the other collar. And this was given to Colonel Volckmann as a gift. Next slide. But while the top officers, some of the regimental commanders, the upper officers were American, most of the staff of all the units were Filipinos. This is a photograph of the USAFIP NL staff taken shortly after the war ended. Volckmann is in the center in the combat uniform, but I'd like to point out two particular Filipinos who were very important in the staff. On the right side, you'll see two Filipinos, one short, one not so short. The second from the left was Major Bado Dangwa, who came from the northern Luzon area. He was a transport operator before the war, and during the war offered his fleet of buses to the Americans. Most of them were destroyed in the battle for Bataan, but he became the transportation officer of the USAFIP NL. And today, those of us familiar with the Ilocos area will remember that there is a Dangwa bus line. That was one of his operations. One camp has been named after him afterwards. On the extreme right, you have Major Domingo Nebres. He was a medical doctor, came from northern Luzon, but I mention him specifically because his son, Father Nebres, would become president of Ateneo, the Manila University later on. His widow was still alive in the 1990s, but unfortunately I wasn't able to meet her. But she did have several stories about her husband. So while it was Americans at the top, the staff who did the hard work were Filipinos. This is now at the USAFIP NL level, which in US Army organization more or less was equivalent to a full division, except that these were volunteers, these were young men, these were not professional soldiers. Most of these were reservists. They had had military training before the war, but they had been called to active duty. Others had had no military training whatsoever, but decided to join the force because they felt it their duty to fight for country. Next slide. This is the emblem or the logo of the USAFIP NL. It is very symbolic. The northern Luzon area is shrouded in black, which symbolized the Japanese occupation, the dark years of the Japanese occupation. In the center of it all is a flame that burns very brightly, and emanating from that flame are 5 rays, which symbolize the hope and the different regiments that the USAFIP NL was comprised of. The logo and the slogan of the USAFIP NL was "We Remained." This was their answer to MacArthur's "I shall return." So if MacArthur said "I shall return," the USAFIP NL said "We remained, we fought on," which was something very important because they didn't have any luxury of life in the lowlands or other areas. They were up in the mountains most of the time, having difficult living conditions, short of food and everything else. Now, the unit that particularly fought the Battle of Bessang Pass was a unit called the 121st Infantry Regiment. If you look at the structure of units at the time, you had at the top a division, and the division was divided into 3 or 4 or even 5 what were called regiments. So the USAFIP NL had 5 specific regiments. Most of these were actually composed of soldiers, volunteers, and other people, including women, incidentally, who had not wanted to accept the Japanese occupation and decided to continue the fight. These were regional areas. Some were in northern Luzon, in Ilocos Norte. Others were in Cagayan. Others were in Abra. The others were in Ilocos Sur. And that's why you have these 5 rays. Essentially, they represented different regional organizations. Not that they were all limited to Ilocanos and Cagayanons or people from the mountain province, the Igorots. There were many Tagalogs. There were many people from other parts of the Philippines as well. So in a sense, we might say it was truly a national movement that was represented by this particular organization. So to focus on the unit that did all of the fight, or most of the fighting, we look into the 101st Infantry Regiment. Next slide. So the 121st Infantry Regiment was one of the original fighting units in northern Luzon. Some of them had been soldiers who had been cut off by the Japanese advance and couldn't make it to Bataan. So they were caught in the mountains. Rather than surrender to the Japanese, they created themselves into this fighting unit. In fact, even before Bataan fell, MacArthur had already recognized them as a fighting unit. So it was designated the 121st Infantry Regiment to differentiate it from the other pre-war units that were in the area. It was under an American, an unsurrendered soldier officer by the name of Colonel George Barnett. But all of the battalions were led by Filipinos. Again, if you follow the structure at the time, it was division at the top, that's USAFIP NL, and then 5 infantry regiments regionally spread out, and then each infantry regiment was composed of 3 or 4 battalions. Each battalion was about 400 men or women, if they were included. The regimental strength was about 1,200, but this included staff, it included support services, and so forth. Now, the unit that did the bulk of the fighting in the Battle of Bessang Pass was the 3rd Battalion, about 400 men, under the command of Major Conrado B. Rigor, the father of Roger Rigor, incidentally. He was only 30 years old at the time. And each battalion was composed of 4 companies, roughly about 100 men each company. And one of the companies that would see the bulk of the fighting was something called L Company, belonging to the 3rd Battalion. It was commanded by Captain Emilio Narcisse, who was 29 years old at that time. He had just observed his birthday before the battle. Most of the men who fought in the battle were in their early 20s. They were 22, 23, 24. At least one of them that I've identified even had his birthday falling during the height of the Battle of Bessang Pass. I don't think he had any chance to celebrate his birthday, but when he turned 20 years old, he was up in the mountains fighting for country. So if you were 20 in 1945 at the height of the battle, you would have joined around 1942 or 1941. That meant you were a teenager. You were barely 16 years old, 17 years old. So by 1945, when you turned 20 or 21, you are now a full adult. You started the war as teenagers, young people, maybe even boys. But when the war ended, they were fully adults. They were men. So the regimental strength on paper was about 1,200 men and women, but the battalion was about 400. Next slide. This is a picture just after the war of Major Conrado B. Rigor, the commander of the 3rd Battalion that did most of the fighting. He's pointing to a Japanese flag here. There's an interesting story about this flag, because when the war ended, Major Rigor was fortunate enough to interview one Japanese admiral who had surrendered. And that admiral, Admiral Shimamoto, it turns out, had been the commander of a submarine division at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. In fact, he was off Pearl Harbor waiting to catch any Japanese planes that would have to crash land and torpedo any American ships that left Pearl Harbor. As a token of his appreciation for Major Rigor's war effort, he turned over this flag, which was flown on December 7, 1941, during the Pearl Harbor attack, turned it over to Major Rigor as a keepsake. That flag still remains today. So you can see how young he was, and yet how important the role he played was. Incidentally, he did not train as a professional officer. He was not a graduate of West Point. He was a graduate of UP, University of the Philippines. And he had been so interested in the military, he had taken up the full reserve officers training course, and he became a regular Army officer in 1939. So he was the leader of this 3rd Battalion. Next slide. Now the USAFIP NL, like most of the regiments, like most of the different units in the North, had their own symbols, had their own logos. And this was the logo of the 121st USAFIP Red Infantry Regiment. It is flanked by 2 bolos, so it's a fighting bolo battalion. And its slogan was "Carry On." And on the right side, we see a picture of Captain Narcisse, the company commander of Company L, that would do much of the fighting in the Bessang Pass area. He was 29 years old at this time. You see his captain's bars there, very young, looking very innocent, but at this time, he was already a combat veteran. Now, next slide. Knowing now that the Filipinos who were fighting were non-professional, they were largely volunteer, they were reservists, their arms were very makeshift arms, we look into the Japanese defenders. Who were the Japanese defending Bessang Pass? Initially, when the battle started in early 1945, there was one independent infantry battalion, the 357th Independent Infantry Battalion. This again was a battalion, about 1,500 men. And if you imagine that you have one Japanese battalion defending Bessang Pass versus what eventually would be only one company, this would be 100 men versus about 1,000 men, 10-to-1 odds in the beginning. And these Japanese soldiers were trained, they were professional, they had had a lot of battle experience, unlike most of the Filipino guerrillas. But the 357th Independent Infantry Battalion was replaced later on by April 1945, by the 73rd Infantry Regiment of the 19th Division. The 19th Division was a very professional Japanese division. The code name of this division was Tora, or Tiger. It came all the way from North Korea. When the Japanese needed reinforcements for Luzon, they sent almost everything they had to Luzon. And one of them was this 19th Division, which came from North Korea. It had been meant as a regular division to stop the Russians from entering North Korea if the Russians entered the war. So they were ready to fight. Then all of a sudden they were shifted to Luzon. They were ready, they were fighters, they had battle experience, they were professional soldiers. And one regiment, which is now about 2,000, 3,000 men, was thrown into the Bessang Pass area. They had enough time there to dig tunnels, dig caves, bunker down, and a second regiment, the 76th Regiment, was also added to them later on. There was artillery support, and the Japanese in control of the area, therefore, pinpointed their artillery to be able to blast at anyone approaching the Bessang Pass area. So what we have is you have 4,000 Japanese men, 4,500 Japanese soldiers who were very well entrenched, dug into foxholes, caves, tunnels. I'm not sure if they're still there. Most of them have since been eroded, but 4,500 men. And who was going to lead the attack on Bessang Pass? One single company, Company L, 100 men. We can see that they were totally outnumbered. Next slide. The commander of the Japanese division, the 19th Division, was Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Ozaki. That's his picture on the left. The Japanese soldiers looked like the picture that we have on the right, with weapons, rifles, submachine guns, artillery support, everything. They were professional, they were well trained. Next slide. Now, the battle for Bessang Pass lasted for several months. In some books, they would say that the battle lasted from January all the way till June. And we'd wonder, why did it take so long? If we divide that period into different stages, we would see that actually the first phase, the preliminary phase, January to March, was one in which we have essentially one company, Company L, trying to attack Bessang Pass. For a while, they actually took Bessang Pass from the Japanese because the Japanese were caught unprepared. And the key town to the east of Bessang Pass was, as we mentioned earlier, Cervantes. One could also reach Cervantes from the lowland, but one would have to pass a very circular, circuitous road going down to the lowlands and then climbing up from an alternative point. So actually, Cervantes was also taken very briefly around February from the Japanese, who were totally unsuspecting. But we'd see that the operations in the Bessang Pass area had to be suspended in March or late February, early March, because by this time, fighting had focused on La Union, San Fernando, La Union, and Baxil Ridge. Most of the men of the division, most of the men of the regiment had to be called to fight in the battle in La Union. Most of that ended by early March. So by mid-March, March 23, headquarters decided to order a full-scale attack, but only with one battalion. This meant about 400, 500 men against 1,000, against almost 4,000 Japanese. Still 10-1 odds. And if you looked at the weapons that we had, that our boys had, we only had carbines, 30 caliber rifles, pistols. We had a few automatic weapons. We had some machine guns. We had artillery that was captured from the Japanese. Can you imagine bringing artillery up into the mountains? We didn't have American artillery support. There was supposedly American air support because the Americans had control of the air at this time. But the trouble was, the Bessang Pass area tends to be shrouded by clouds after lunch. And so the time for the attacks could only be done in the morning, between, let's say, 10 to 12. After that, no attacks could be held. But the Japanese had dug in, and so no matter how the aerial attacks would be launched, the Japanese were able to survive all of this. Now, Phase two would be this major assault by one battalion. It's Major Rigor's battalion. In April, the Japanese, realizing the importance of Bessang Pass, would launch a major counterattack and push back the 121st Infantry Regiment, almost to where it started. The Japanese used all the forces at their command and really pushed our forces back. So from mid-April to May 1945, there would be a stalemate. And by late May, the USAFE NL headquarters, plus the Americans would say, let's get this over with. Finally, the USAFE NL sent other reinforcements, other regiments to the front, and the Americans provided the USAFE NL forces with artillery support from the lowlands. So the final push was made in late May and went into June 14. All of this, when you look at all of this fighting, the stalemate particularly, that was a stalemate for about a month and a half, our men could not rest because while there was little fighting at night, the Japanese were good night fighters. And therefore, you had to still be alert during the night time. And next slide. These were some of the characteristics of the fighting there up in the Bessang Pass area. This was fighting in the mountains. It was only one road, Highway 4, the Tagudin-Cervantes Road. But it was muddy. Every afternoon it tended to rain. So that caused the road to be very muddy. There were virtually no trails. The guerrillas had to make their own trails. Some had to climb mountains, and those mountains had no handholds, they had no footholds. The guerrillas had to make them themselves. So it was really an uphill battle. For a while, particularly during the stalemate period, it was a seesaw battle. The Japanese launching a counterattack, the guerrillas launching a counterattack. But again, if you look at the imbalance, the Japanese had artillery, the Japanese had trained men, the Japanese had heavy weapons. Our men had even weapons captured from the Japanese. We didn't have enough weapons. We had to face fog, we had to face rain, we had to face the cold. It was an uphill battle all the time. Next pictures will show just what it was like. Next slide. There was very limited air and artillery support due to low visibility, particularly in the afternoon. There were no heavy weapons except mortars and the few artillery pieces that the guerrillas had captured from the Japanese. But imagine, if you fire these weapons, where are you going to get the ammunition? The ammunition will have to be brought to the front by other guerrillas carrying the boxes through the very difficult mountain trails. So you had difficulty of supply. What food were our guerrillas going to exist on? How would they subsist? They couldn't bring food from the ground, from the lowlands up. They had to bring some of what they could, but the rest of the food they had to make do with whatever was around. If there were camotes, if there were edible plants, they subsisted on that. Fighting was limited mainly to the daylight hours. They could rest during the night, but again, the Japanese were good at night fighting. So you can imagine that after 2 months of continuous fighting, you would have the troops exhausted, very tired, and yet wanting to reach the objective, which was Bessang Pass. Next slide. This shows what the terrain was like. One lane road, very narrow, a dirt road, and you'll notice the difficult terrain. The Japanese were in command of the heights. So if you were a guerrilla, you were climbing up the hills here, you were climbing up these steep cliffs, and the Japanese were up in the hills firing down at you. And so it was really, literally an uphill battle. Very, very difficult. Plus, given the weather conditions and the clouds and the fog, that made it a very difficult battle. One of the most difficult battles in the whole Philippines by our forces. Next slide. This shows what happened to that highway, Highway 4 or Route 4, during the rains. Transportation bogged down. And this was already after the fighting. During the fighting, trucks or jeeps or other vehicles couldn't get to the road because it was still under Japanese control. Next slide. This is what it looked like from the lowlands. You'd see mortar support from the lowland areas. you'll notice the outfits of the guerrillas. Later on, the Japanese were interrogated, they were interviewed. What was the strength of the Filipinos? Oh, the Filipinos had American support. The Filipinos had a lot of support by submarines. They had the most modern weapons. If we look at the weapons they're holding here, the guy in the center is holding a carbine, 30 caliber rifle. Not very good insofar as firing power was concerned. The mortar that you have here is a captured Japanese mortar. It's not even an American mortar, using captured Japanese rounds. And the outfits of these people, two of them are wearing short pants. Some of them have boots or combat shoes. The others are simply wearing their on bare feet. Only one man in this photograph has a helmet, and it's not even the modern US helmet. This was the 1942 Bataan style helmet. The others are wearing cloth caps. This was the typical guerrilla that would fight in the Battle of Bessang Pass. Very limited weaponry, just a lot of brawn, a lot of guts, a lot of patriotism, a lot of determination to get the job done. Next slide. This is another picture showing the terrain in the area. And again, you see the guy in the center wearing shorts. At least he has boots. The guy closest to the camera has non-regular shoes, but nobody has a helmet here. And the rifles they're using are essentially carbines. These are small guns. The tubes that you see in front, these are mortar tubes. So there was mortar firing going on at this time to reduce the Japanese. But basically, this was all we had: brawn, determination, small arms to fight the Japanese up in the hills with their artillery, with their emplacements. It was truly, really a man's job. Next slide. How would one get food, ammunition, etc. up? Laborers had to bring all these boxes up the same way that the soldiers had gone up. But since the laborers or the supply people would be much behind, sometimes the soldiers would go hungry because the supplies didn't reach them. And so again, you can imagine the difficulty of those boys in the front line, lacking food, lacking sleep, having to be on the alert all the time, but ready to launch the attack. Next slide. Another picture showing the difficulty of terrain. By this time, much of the underbrush had already been destroyed by American bombing. But again, the terrain was so difficult that you had to make makeshift bridges, you had to make makeshift ladders like this. This was done after this photograph was taken after the fighting, when American troops were coming up already in support. But while the USAFIP NL boys were fighting, this was hardly the case. Next slide. For the last phase of the fighting, late May to early June, you have American headquarters finally giving in and saying, these USAFIP NL, the 121st Infantry Regiment boys, needed more support. And so they assigned one field artillery battalion, 105 millimeter guns, to fire onto the mountains. These were in the lowlands, and since they were firing onto the mountains, the Japanese mountain positions, they had to fire at maximum elevation. That's why we see the guns here pointing way up, because they're really firing. This is the highest they can fire. And the Japanese were very close by in the mountains. And it was our guys, the Filipino guerrillas, who were telling these artillerymen, the Japanese are located here, fire at this particular location. So the observers were our people on the front line. Next slide. Finally, on June 14, 1945, Bessang Pass was taken. Interestingly, the company that took Bessang Pass, the final assault was prepared night of June 13. They planned it very well. They tried to locate the Japanese positions. They called for American aerial support if the weather allowed. The Americans did bomb the area very briefly before noon, but before that, the men of Company K and Company L was there fighting since February. This was the one of Captain Narcisse. They charged up the last areas to Bessang Pass, and upon reaching Bessang Pass, They were so overjoyed that they waved the flag. This stamp was issued 40 years after the fighting in 1985, the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Bessang Pass. It's wrong in many counts. First, our soldiers were not dressed in this way. They were, again, in short pants, or they were in short sleeve shirts. They were in whatever they had. So they didn't have this uniform. They didn't have helmets, at least if they did have the helmets, it was the 1941 World War I type helmet. And they didn't have a Philippine flag. So this is very dramatic. It's very symbolic. But the commander of the unit that took Bessang Pass, Captain Narcisse, realized when he reached the top, when finally Bessang Pass was in Philippine hands, he said, we have to have a symbol that we've finally taken Bessang Pass. He didn't have a Philippine flag. He didn't have an American flag. All he had was an olive drab army towel. So he took that towel, looked for a branch, a pine tree branch, tied the towel to the branch, and waved it for all to see. And when people on the ground saw that, a resounding cheer came up, Bessang Pass is ours. Tears for joy fell at that time. It was a very victorious moment. It was not the end of the fighting. Shortly after Captain Narcisse waved that flag, Japanese snipers fired at him, but that was the last fighting in Bessang Pass. By afternoon, Bessang Pass was now in Filipino hands. That opened the back door now to General Yamashita's headquarters. And next slide. This is what Bessang Pass looked like after the fighting. You see how rugged the terrain was and how much of it was destroyed by the fighting. All the rocks on the side, the landslides caused by the fighting. You'd still have loose Japanese around here, so it was still very dangerous at this time. But by this time, the guerrillas had cleared the way up the front, were now in Cervantes, and had advanced the line. Now that it was safe, these American reinforcements were able to come up with more supplies. But you'll notice the trailer on the left, it says actually 121st Infantry Philippine Army, one of the very few pieces of equipment with wheels that the Philippine unit had. Next slide. So 2 more months of hard fighting would remain, but the writing was on the wall. And even General Yamashita realized that this was a very decisive moment. Incidentally, the Japanese did not call it Bessang Pass. They still don't call it Bessang Pass. That's why when I was reviewing Japanese materials, I could not find any mention of Bessang Pass at all. I said, was it that irrelevant to them? And then I found out, no, they had another name for Bessang Pass. They named it after a little barrio very close to Bessang Pass. The barrio's name was Takbo. The Japanese pronounced it as Takubo. And so it was Takubo Pass. And that was written about all over. Then I realized, yes, this was indeed a very major battle. It's just that they never called it Bessang Pass. They called it Takubo Pass, but it was well written about. Next slide. What was the cost? The 121st Infantry Regiment, which did the bulk of the fighting, it was Major Rigor's regiment, lost 74 killed in action. Relatively small number, but 150 Now, the total number of Japanese losses is estimated to about 2,200. So if you can imagine the odds, the men were fighting against the odds, and insofar as the Japanese defeat was concerned, it was a major Japanese defeat for them. Next slide. We're now coming to the end of the presentation. Okay. Well, the next one is supposed to be the appraisals. The Americans thought that, well, these were guerrillas, but the Americans trusted the guerrillas to be able to fight. And so one of the American commanders later on, and the official historian would say, a boy had been trying to do a man's job. USAFIP NL made a substantial contribution towards the liberation of northern Luzon. The Japanese, interrogated after the war on the battle, would say their way of attacking, that is the guerrillas, was steady. Once they occupied a place, they established a good defense and advanced again. So these are the appraisals. Next slide. So the Americans initially poo-pooed, before this, the appraisals. The Americans initially felt the Filipinos could not do the job. But when they finally won in Bessang Pass, they realized this was a major victory for a guerrilla unit. One will notice that the other units fighting in the Villaverde Trail, fighting from Baguio, these were American divisions, fully armed, fully equipped, ready, fully trained, having a lot of experience in combat fighting in the Southern Pacific. These guerrillas now were used to fighting hit and run, ambush operations. This was one of the few times they really fought as a major combat unit, and they won. Next slide. Next slide. So after the war, the Philippine government recognized the importance of the battle and put up a memorial in 1954. This was basically 9 years after the battle. Many of the soldiers were still alive, many of the officers were still alive, and that memorial still stands. So can we have it was there a while ago.
Yeah, I believe we're trying to get that slide in, Doctor, but
okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, while we can't get the slide in, you see that the Americans recognize the importance of the Filipino contribution, and the Japanese also recognized that contribution. So this is the memorial that was put up in 1954, the one on the right. The one on the left was something that was put up later in the 1990s. All the units that fought in the battle for Bessang Pass are recorded there. The USAFIP NL regiments, the US Army units, the Air Force units are all listed down. But credit was not given to the units that did the most fighting, the 121st Infantry Regiment, which was there from beginning to end. It's just listed as one of the 4 regiments that fought here. And since it is the biggest number, it comes last in the list of those given credit. So it's unfortunate that that particular unit, which did so much of the fighting, was not given the credit that it deserves. Next slide. This is what it looks like during a foggy day. And most of the time it tends to be foggy, especially in the afternoon. So this is the type of weather that our boys were fighting in that battle for Bessang Pass. Next slide. In 1995, a special stamp was put out to commemorate the battle for Bessang Pass. You have that classic picture of Bessang Pass. You have the symbol of USAFIP NL, but you also have, by some strange twist of fate, the symbol of the 37th Division. I don't know who was in charge of making this stamp. I was not consulted. The 37th Infantry Division was nowhere in this area at this time. They were in Cagayan, fighting all throughout this time. So it shouldn't have been there. The credit should really have been for the USAFIP NL. Next slide. We're coming to the end. This is what some of the veterans looked like in the 1990s and early 2000s. Most of them have since passed away. Now we would see that if you were 20 years old during the fighting, which were the youngest guerrillas at the time, you would be 95 years old today. So very few of them are still around, but they do attend the reunions, and they're very proud of having served their country. So today we commemorates 75 years of this battle. It's one of many, but it stands out as being a Filipino victory that won against very strong Japanese forces with very minimal American support. So it was one that deserves more attention by this generation, and those who survive should be allowed to tell their stories, and this particular victory should be given more publicity because they deserve it. With that then, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Good afternoon, good morning.
Thank you so much, Professor Jose. We will now read some of the questions typed in by our audience as you were presenting. There have been quite a number of comments and questions.
Yes.
We hope we can accommodate them in the very limited time we have. So here's one that came in. Were there any women who fought in the battle?
They did not fight in the battle per se. It was extremely difficult terrain. So there were women in the guerrilla resistance movement, yes, but they were not in the front lines here, at least not in Bessang Pass. It was too difficult terrain for them. What they did was, there was something called the Women's Auxiliary Service. Most of them were in the guerrilla camps. They were nurses, they prepared the food, they mended the clothing of the men. Some even made shoes for the men if they could. So they provided backup support. In other parts of northern Luzon, women were also active. There was one veteran I interviewed who had fought in Bataan. He had been released from prison camp, went to Baguio, where he was from, met and courted a woman, and they married during the war. He became a guerrilla, and his wife insisted on staying with him because she said she didn't want to stay in the hospital waiting for him to come back wounded or maimed, or she didn't want to prepare food or anything like that. So she insisted on staying with him. He operated in the Baguio area. So she and he were there, husband and wife team, sharing the same foxhole, firing guns, fighting together. So in Bessang Pass per se, not quite, but in other areas of northern Luzon, yes, they were there.
Another question, Professor. Did the Yusufip NL work closely with the Huk Balahap?
No, they were totally separate units. The Huk Balahap was in central Luzon, basically Tarlac, Pampanga. Yusufip NL was in the north. So again, Cagayan. It had units all the way up into Apari and even the Batanes, but the geographical divide was such that they did not cooperate with each other. I think the closest point at which they did get in touch with each other was in Pangasinan, where some of them did work together. But again, you have much of the fighting taking place in Cagayan, that's north of the Balete Pass area, and then the Mountain Province area. So you have a geographical divide here. The Huk Balahap was essentially in central Luzon. Yusufip NL was, as mentioned by the name, northern Luzon.
Another question, Professor. Do you believe that this battle is just as noteworthy as the battles in Bataan and Corregidor?
Well, I think the battles of Bataan and Corregidor were quite different. I'd say the objective of those battles was quite different. The objective of Bataan and Corregidor was to hold on as long as possible until assistance could arrive from the outside. That way, morale could be boosted and so forth. In the case of Bessang Pass, this was an offensive victory, and the guerrillas fought. What we had in Bataan was an organized warfare following basically the traditions or the standards, the tactics of conventional warfare. In the case of Bessang Pass, this was guerrilla warfare fighting against an organized Japanese resistance, against organized Japanese forces. So we have they serve different purposes. Of course, in the case of Bataan and Corregidor, both of them surrendered. So this was kind of a negative, something that people were affected very strongly about, but unfortunately, Bessang Pass has not fully been commemorated. I guess one other difference is the number of people who participated. If you look at Bataan and Corregidor, the whole Bataan and Corregidor campaign involved something like 60 to 70,000 men. The Bessang Pass campaign only involved about 2,000 at the most, 3,000. And so it was much smaller in detail.
A couple more questions. There are a lot of questions coming in, Professor. How would you describe why Filipinos were successful in such an overwhelming odd?
I think it was really determination. Many of them were fighting for home, fighting for country, fighting for family. And I think the sense of pride that, you know, we don't want the Americans here. We are capable of doing it ourselves. Also consider that anger had built up against the Japanese for 3 years. So it was their way of achieving vengeance for family members who had been killed before. It was a way of pushing back the tide of battle. A number of them were actually Bataan veterans. So some of them were really trying to offset the defeat in Bataan. And so I think it was really a strong sense of patriotism, a strong sense of, what would we have? A strong sense of determination that they had to get the job done and that they were going to get the job done. I think that above all, because considering the weapons that they had, they didn't have a bazooka, they didn't have flamethrowers, and the Americans had those. Terrain was difficult, but it was really more of determination. And I think it's that kind of thing that we would like to see more of. In Bataan, there were some limited victories. Again, determination saw those victories. But this is one particular battle where truly, I think it was willpower and the determination to win that. So, I mean, the fact that you have Captain Narcisse coming up and waving that flag, and he was there as early as January, and then now he was really there from beginning to end.
Okay, 2 more questions before we end this presentation, Professor. Did the U.S. government give, or were there any recognition or medals given to the fighting men of Bessang Pass because of this battle?
Yes. Yes, I was not able to actually, there's a short video. I was not able to tap that for this. After the fighting, some of the heroes of Bessang Pass were awarded medals by the U.S. Army in La Union. Some of them were given silver stars. Those who were wounded were given Purple Hearts and so forth. I don't have the list of those who were given the awards, but of course, given the nature of the fighting, I think all of them did deserve to be awarded, especially the companies that fought from beginning to end. Now, insofar as recognition was concerned, USAFIT NL was one of those units that was recognized fairly early after the war. Ironically, while it was very well organized during the war, the unit itself was not known to General MacArthur until about 1944. I mean, so distant was Luzon to Australia at that time that MacArthur's intelligence on the guerrillas in North Luzon was very vague. So submarines were only able to come in to bring supplies very late. But it was one of the best organized units in the whole of the Philippines. And they were given recognition soon after the war. Of course, that recognition was never enough. And there were issues that came up after, insofar as back pay and other items due the veterans.
One last question, and I do hope that this conversation would continue to spawn itself. But one last question. How do you think the Filipinos should be remembered in their role to liberate the Philippines from the Japanese?
I think the Filipinos should be given a bigger credit for participating in the fighting. When you read, for example, about at least Bessang Pass, the Americans had to realize that American support was really basically artillery and aerial support, no ground forces. But if you look at, let's say, the Battle of Ipo Dam, which was another crucial guerrilla victory by the Filipino soldiers, if you read the American histories, it's the American division that fought there that gets most of the credit. And you talk to the Filipino veterans who fought in Ipo Dam, and it was really they who did the hard fighting. Again, terrain like in Bessang Pass, mountainous area, very narrow roads. And that has not really been given much attention. Much of the Visayas was really controlled by guerrillas when the Americans landed. The Japanese were forced into the mountains. Some of the towns in Mindanao were liberated by guerrillas, and that has not been given sufficient attention. There was a lot of hard fighting, of course, that the US Army did, but I think the role of the Filipinos in preparing for that, giving the intelligence, the sacrifice, the heroes of the war, especially those who paid with their lives. Many of us don't realize who these heroes were. My own grandfather was killed by the Japanese in Bulacan. I didn't know that until I was in college. There were many more who joined the guerrillas and never came back. They simply answered the call. And so I think that that recognition will have to come from both the US government and the Philippine government.
Well, Dr. Jose, thank you again for this very illuminating presentation. Are there any last words before we say our final thank you?
Well, the last words, I guess, would be that this was, if you look at the resistance movement, it was really a national resistance movement. It involved people from all walks of life, professionals, farmers, drivers. It involved people from all cultures, from all language groups, northern Luzon all the way down to Basilan and all the way down to the Sulu area. It was a national movement. And most of those who fought in it, as is the case of most wars, most of those who fought were very young, very excited, very patriotic. This is the kind of thing that it would be nice to have the young generation today recognize and replicate, that those men and women who joined the resistance movement in World War II were extremely young. Many of them had nothing. They left their families. They suffered a lot, but they did it for country. And that is something that I would like to see happen again.
Yes, and with that, indeed, the patriotism of the Filipino, the young Filipinos. Once again, on behalf of the Foundation for Philippine Progress, we thank you, Professor Rico Jose, for your insights and invaluable research on Bessang Pass. We are truly fortunate to have had this opportunity to learn about this momentous battle and the Filipinos behind them. We are anticipating that this conversation shall spawn more discussions in an effort to have a deeper understanding of our people's history from the lens of Filipino historians like you. And most importantly, thank you to our audience today for spending an afternoon or early morning in Manila with Dr. Jose. Thank you. And so we look forward to your feedback, ladies and gentlemen, and comments about today's presentation. And before you go, let us turn this over now to I.
Thank you, Professor Jose and Kuya Roger. That was very informative. I must admit, Kuya Roger is a dear friend of mine and a very modest man. I had no idea about his family history, and it has inspired me to learn more about the untold histories of the Philippines, including my own family's regional area of Ilocos Sur. I am truly honored that the Foundation for Philippine Progress has connected me back to our homeland. I invite you to be part of our family. There's room for you in our work. Please make sure you follow us on social media at Philippine Progress on Instagram, /Philippine Progress on Facebook. You can also be a partner for Progress at tinyurl.com /Partner for Progress. Involvement ranges from being part of our mailing list to attending our events to volunteering, donating, or hosting a fundraising to our efforts. Or donate via philippineprogress.org /donate, or by setting up a Facebook fundraiser. These simple acts of generosity do much in the lives of our kababayan in the Philippines. Thank you for joining us again. And now I will pass it on to Julene, our project coordinator, to announce the raffle winners.
Okay, so our two raffle prizes for today, we have textiles from Mindanao. It's a malong, a traditional tube-shaped dress that can be worn in different styles and ways. And then a set of a fan and wallet, both of which are hand woven in Mindanao as well. So I have my hat here with the names. So for the fan and wallet, we have Marianne Roy. Is Marianne still on? And Kayla Davis for the malong. So we'll reach out to you for your contact information if we don't already have it to send these prizes off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolene. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our board members, our staff team, and all of the participants tonight. Thank you, Professor Jose, for such an educational and eye-opening presentation. And again, thank you to Erna of American Center of Philippine Arts for donating the original Rondalia music, which we've been playing in the background. So we invite you to the rest of our events in this webinar series. Next Thursday, we will be having part 2 of the Tagalog Learning and Appreciation events, followed by the following Saturday event, which will focus naman on the Filipino cuisine, featuring Food Network's Chop winner, Chef Charlene. And there is many more in this event series. So to be able to see the comprehensive list, please visit tinyurl.com/iheartph to see the list of the events and to also register to the events. And lastly, we would like to seek any feedback that you have on this webinar, and we would love to hear if there are any topics that you'd be interested in for future events. We'd love to hear from you. Please give us feedback at tinyurl.com/iheartphfeedback. We hope to see you for the rest of our series. Magandang gabi or magandang umaga sa Pilipinas at salamat po sa inyong lahat. Thank you.